A political decision that destroyed decades of economic progress overnight. Ladies and gentlemen, Brexit.
I think I feel pretty much the same as the rest of the country, just frustrated.
The United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union was more than just a withdrawal. It triggered a chain reaction that sent shockwaves through its trade and industries. From vanishing export markets to crippled supply chains, the fallout was catastrophic. How exactly did this happen? Who let it happen? What are the consequences British businesses are facing today? Did you know 50% of all small businesses fail within the first 5 years, according to data from the Bureau of Labour Statistics, as reported by Fundera? Approximately 20% of small businesses fail within the first year. Surviving, let alone thriving, is a huge gamble in the cutthroat industry, one that prepares you for failure from the minute you set up shop. But Brexiteers were hopeful, because besides the several hundreds of other reasons why businesses fail, they believed that they just eliminated one of them. That's right, when the United Kingdom announced its formal withdrawal from the European Union, as determined by the 51% majority voter turnaround in 2016, Brexiteers believed that they'd given small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, a fighting chance. For the first time in a long time, they believed that British SMEs would have an opportunity to flourish now that they had fewer regulatory constraints and greater autonomy. What was standing between SMEs and flourishing in the first place? The European Union. How? A central claim of the Pro-Brexit campaign was that EU membership had caused an undue strain on SME operations. The argument here was that the EU's rigid regulations and compliance laws were designed with large corporations in mind. Think multinationals. Of course, the little guy couldn't keep up with these regulations and was at a great disadvantage. Because the UK was a part of the EU, consequently, the single market SMEs had to go, allegedly above and beyond to keep up. To be honest, they never could. So the statistics that 50% of all SMEs fail within the first 5 years, at least in Brexit's advocates' eyes, was because of membership in the European Union. SMEs are at the heart of innovation and entrepreneurship, says an expert from the European Commission's official page. According to the EC, 99% of European businesses are SMEs. They provide jobs for more than 85 million European citizens. The ideas and solutions of 24.3 million entrepreneurs, men and women, have contributed to a sustainable and digital economy, central to Europe's competitiveness. Likewise, the European Commission is committing to supporting enterprises from the moment they start throughout their lifetime. Ironically, a lifetime cut short because of the EU, according to pro-Brexit advocates. One frequently cited example was the EU's approach to health and safety, data protection, and environmental regulations, which, while promoting common standards, were seen as excessively bureaucratic. This one-size-fits-all model was hurting SMEs. Based on the UK government's impact assessments in 2014 prices, the total cost to the UK economy of the top 100 EU-derived regulations is €46.6 billion annually. We're presenting the facts of the case right now, and the fact was that pro-Brexit campaigners did have a point. This was noted by Pavel Swidlicki, a Brexit analyst working with Open Europe. He claimed that the bad news is that overall EU regulation costs too much in relation to the benefit it generates. But that didn't necessarily mean that he was on board for Brexit. You see, Brexit advocates had a point, and EU regulations were burdensome in several ways. But the out that they wanted wasn't going to alleviate the burden. Now, let's revisit some facts minus the sensationalism. That is, let's talk about how EU membership actually helped British small and medium-sized enterprises. You see, Brexit brought disruption, uncertainty, and increased costs that made it more difficult to survive, let alone thrive, in a newly redefined trade landscape. While large multinational corporations often had the resources to adapt to the new rules, the little guy, independent retailers, niche manufacturers, and micro-exporters bore the brunt of the transition. EU membership offered several tangible advantages to British SMEs. Membership allowed UK firms seamless access to the world's largest single market, enabling them to trade goods and services across borders without tariffs, custom checks, or regulatory divergence. This frictionless trade environment allowed even the smallest firms to expand beyond the UK without the complexities associated with exporting to non-EU countries. Labour mobility was another benefit. The EU's freedom of movement rules enabled British SMEs to recruit skilled workers from across Europe without the need for visas or complex sponsorship procedures. For sectors like hospitality, construction, and technology, this access to a broad talent pool was critical in meeting staffing needs and maintaining competitiveness. Assuming our trading relationship with Europe stays the same, do you anticipate that things will be getting better or worse for your business over the next 3 years? Here's how respondents answered when asked this question by the European movement. They didn't see it getting better. If anything, SME owners believed that it was about to get much, much worse. Through it all, we really have to ask, was this gamble worth taking? Where was the autonomy that Brexiteers had promised SMEs? But what about the UK government's 2014 impact assessment? What about the €46.6 billion per year? Notably, that number has since changed owing to rising costs and a constantly evolving economy. However, the number was nothing less than a real eye-opener for people on the edge of voting to stay or leave the EU back in 2016. A major criticism here was that the UK gave more than it got back. As one of the largest economies in the world and a member of the EU, the UK contributed significantly to the EU's budget. Of course, it wasn't the single largest contributor. That would be Germany. By 2023, the former Big Three, Germany, France, and the UK, were rebranded as the Big Four, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. After the transitional period ended in 2021, the UK was no longer a contributor to the EU budget, something that Brexit campaigns advocated for. This was the autonomy that they'd sought back in 2016, and this was what was delivered to them eventually. Still, this didn't necessarily mean that the UK now had a lot of money to spend on SMEs. If anything, it was the complete opposite. In 2016, the BBC did one of its famous reality checks. This time the claim was, are there 2,500 new regulations every year from the EU? Following the sensationalism of the impact assessment and how the Leave campaign was using it to further their goals. A frequently cited claim by Brexit supporters was that the European Union imposed 2,500 new regulations each year, costing British businesses £600 million weekly, worth evoking Article 50 override. However, in truth, the volume of new regulations had decreased significantly. While the EU did produce a large number of laws in the 1980s and 1990s, with 1983 seeing over 14,500 new regulations, the number had declined by the time of the referendum. For example, in 2015, the EU passed 839 new regulations and 430 amending regulations, totaling 1,269, well below the 2,500 figure often quoted. Additionally, many of these laws had little to no relevance to UK businesses. For instance, regulations concerning olive oil production or tobacco farming are largely irrelevant to most UK sectors. It's also essential to understand that EU regulations automatically take effect in all member states without requiring national legislation. In contrast, EU directives provide general goals that each country must implement through their own legal systems. Coming back to the report by Open Europe, these figures considered only the costs and not the benefits. When benefits were factored in based on the UK government's own assessments, those same laws contributed a net positive of £25.3 billion a year, or roughly £487 million a week. Most importantly, even after a withdrawal, not all regulatory costs would disappear. As Open Europe noted, the UK would still need to follow many EU rules in order to trade with a member state. Compliance with these standards would remain essential for any businesses looking to operate within the European market. Would rejoining the EU single market help your business? Here's how respondents answered when asked this question by the European movement as part of a 2023 study. Resoundingly, yes. The single market is vital to the UK's prosperity, coming from the official website of the Government of the United Kingdom itself circa 2011. Going over the government's own publication, let's dissect how the single market was actually helpful for the UK's economy. British businesses were given access to a vast market of millions of people and supporting multi-trillions in economic activity. Half of the UK's trade and foreign investments have historically been tied to EU markets, underpinning roughly 3.5 million jobs linked to the export of goods and services to the EU based on a 2011 report. The removal of trade barriers allowed UK firms to operate seamlessly across borders, boosting trade volumes and job creation. The single market fostered economic growth by encouraging high productivity and efficiency through competition, innovation, and specialization. British manufacturers benefited from mutual standards, better supply chains, and affordable imports, while consumers enjoyed greater choice and lower prices. For the UK, the single market was not just a trade zone, but a powerful growth engine, according to the government itself. One of the most significant challenges that small UK businesses faced following Brexit was the sudden increase in trade complexity with the European Union, the UK's largest trading partner. Exiting the single market and customs union introduced a wave of red tape that disrupted even routine transactions. Customs declarations, origin rules, and VAT reforms brought an administrative workload that overwhelmed many small firms lacking the infrastructure to absorb such change. According to Vince Cable, Vice President of the European Movement, the research by European Movement UK shows just how much ongoing damage is still being done by Brexit. Devastating barriers to trading with the EU have forced some companies out of business. Red tape, lack of workers, huge hikes in overheads, Britain's small and medium enterprises have sustained a disproportionate amount of the damage. This was an extract from the European Movement's article titled Brexit and Business. In their own words, the report was essentially an analysis of a 2023 1,774-person survey that was aimed at understanding how business owners and employees felt about Brexit and changing trade policies with the EU. A substantial 93.6% of surveyed businesses reported negative impacts from Brexit, while just 3.2% viewed the departure from the EU positively. This widespread dissatisfaction spanned all regions and sectors, from sole traders to large enterprises. Even in Northern Ireland, where EU market access remains more intact, added paperwork and confusion in trade with the rest of the UK has complicated operations. Regardless of how prepared businesses felt before the transition ended in January 2021, with an average preparedness score of 4.9 out of 10, many remain unhappy with the current trading landscape. Both well-prepared and underprepared businesses expressed disappointment, and 2/3 still haven't returned to pre-pandemic trade levels. Some companies have already relocated operations to the EU, while others have downsized, cut hours, or closed due to Brexit-related trade obstacles. The most consistent and pressing issue reported is the burden of paperwork involved in EU trade. Over 53% said that the complexity of new documentation makes running their businesses significantly harder. When asked how the government could improve the situation, nearly a third suggested stronger support for imports and exports, while many others advocated for adjoining the single market or customs union. Businesses across industries shared stories of lost EU clients, disrupted supply chains, and cancelled contracts. Sole traders in services, such as musicians and tech freelancers, also reported challenges competing with EU-based counterparts still benefiting from freedom of movement. Labour shortages, especially in engineering, agriculture, hospitality, and logistics, are another major concern. Many companies noted difficulties hiring EU nationals, with some staff returning home due to post-Brexit uncertainty. Firms reported losing access to critical EU programs like Erasmus Plus and Horizon, affecting innovation and sustainability. Amid these challenges, 95.5% believe that rejoining the single market would benefit them, and 2/3 expect the UK will eventually return to it. Ultimately, the European movement asked SME owners what they believed the future held for the trade relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU. Do you believe that the UK will ultimately rejoin the EU single market and customs union? 65.5% believed the nation would, 27% held on to hope, and only 6.5% didn't see it happening. This was back in 2023. As of April 2025, the UK has not rejoined the EU single market or the customs union. Will it ever?